In 1985, my wife made a bet with me on our wedding night. She looked me in the eye and said, "Jack, if you put up with me for 40 years, I will give you something impossible." I laughed it off as a joke because Catherine was always full of wild ideas. We never spoke about it again. She died last month in 2024, exactly 40 years later to the day. Yesterday, while the dirt was still fresh on her grave, a lawyer I had never met knocked on my door. He handed me an old brass key, an address in the Scottish Highlands, and a letter that simply read, "You won the bet, Jack. Go alone. Dawn not trust anyone, not even our children." When I arrived in Scotland and opened that door, I realized I had been living with a stranger. And as for my children, they did not come to the funeral to mourn. They came to hunt. My name is Jack Reynolds. I am 71 years old, and I spent my life as a structural engineer ensuring that skyscrapers in Seattle did not collapse under pressure. I know how to spot a hairline fracture in concrete before the whole building comes down. But I failed to see the cracks in my own family until the day I buried my wife. If you are new here, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It helps this old man share his story with the world. And let me know in the comments which city you are listening from. I always love reading where you folks are. The sound of wet earth hitting a casket is a sound you never forget. It has a finality to it. A heavy thud that says it is over. But for my son Brian and my daughter Emily, it was not a sound of ending. It was a starting pistol. The funeral service was barely over. The guests were still driving away in the rain, and I was standing in my kitchen staring at a sink full of unwashed dishes. My hands were shaking. Not from age, but from a grief so deep it felt like my chest was caving in. Catherine was my anchor. Without her, I felt adrift. I walked into the living room expecting to find my children crying, expecting us to sit together and share memories of their mother. Maybe look at old photo albums. Instead, I found Brian pacing the room with his phone pressed to his ear. He is 42 years old and calls himself an entrepreneur, which is a polite way of saying he has started 6 businesses, and I have paid for him to close 6 businesses. He was running his hand along the fireplace mantel, not affectionately, but like he was checking the quality of the wood. He was speaking loudly. "Yeah, the square footage is huge. The lot alone is worth $2 million easily. I can get it listed by Monday. We just need to clear out the old furniture." I stood in the doorway, frozen. My wife had been in the ground for less than 2 hours, and my son was already selling the house she loved. Emily was sitting on the sofa scrolling on her tablet. She is 38, a real estate agent who drives a leased Porsche she cannot afford. She looked up at me and there were no tears in her eyes. Just a calculation. "Dad," she said, her voice dangerously sweet. Brian and I were thinking, "This house is just too big for you now. It is full of stairs and maintenance. It is a safety hazard, really. We found this amazing assisted living facility in downtown Seattle. It has a view of the water and 24-hour care. You would love it." I looked at them. Really looked at them. I saw the greed radiating off them like heat waves. They did not care about my safety. They cared about the equity in this house. I built this house with my own hands in 1990. I designed the load-bearing walls. I reinforced the foundation. I knew every beam and every screw, and they wanted to liquidate it to pay off their debts. I knew Brian owed money to some bad people because of his gambling. I knew Emily was drowning in credit card debt to maintain her socialite image. I took a deep breath. "I am grieving," I said, my voice raspy. "I am not invalid. I am not selling the house." Brian ended his call and turned to me. His face hardened. "Come on, Dad. Be realistic. Mom is gone. You are 71. You are going to start forgetting things. You are going to leave the stove on. We are just trying to protect our inheritance. I mean, protect you." He slipped. He said the quiet part out loud. our inheritance. I was about to throw them out. I was about to scream that I was perfectly capable of living in my own home. But then a heavy knock echoed from the front door. It was strange. Everyone who came for the funeral had already left. I turned my back on my children and walked to the door. Outside, the rain was pouring down in sheets, typical Seattle weather. Standing on the porch was a man I did not recognize. He was soaked, wearing a trench coat that looked like it was from another century. He held a briefcase tight against his chest. "Mr. Reynolds?" he asked. His accent was thick. "Scottish." I nodded. "Yes." He did not step inside. He glanced over my shoulder, looking past me into the house where Brian and Emily were watching. He lowered his voice to a whisper. "My name is Hamish McAllister. I was your wife's attorney. Not the family lawyer, her personal attorney." I frowned. Catherine did not have a personal attorney. We shared everything. Or so I thought. "She gave me strict instructions," he continued, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "I was to deliver this to you only after the funeral, and only if you were alone. But I see you have company." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. It was sealed with wax. He pressed it into my hand. It felt cold and heavy. "Hide this," he whispered. "Do not let them see it. Do not let them know I was here. Read it when they leave." Why, I asked, bewildered. "Because Jack," he said, his eyes intense and gray like the storm behind him. "The woman you married was not who you thought she was. She was protecting you. Now you have to protect yourself." He turned and vanished into the rain as quickly as he appeared. I stood there for a moment, the heavy envelope burning a hole in my hand. I could feel a hard object inside. A key. I shoved the envelope into the inside pocket of my suit jacket right against my heart. My pulse was racing. I closed the door and turned around. Brian was standing right there. He had moved silently across the room. He was too close. His eyes were narrowed, fixated on the bulge in my jacket pocket. "Who was that at the door?" Dad Brian asked. His tone was casual, but his body language was aggressive. He was leaning forward like a predator. "Just a neighbor paying respects," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A neighbor," Brian scoffed. "In a trench coat. Who did not come in." "And what did he give you?" "Nothing," I said. "Just a condolence card." Brian stepped closer. He reached out a hand. "Let me see it. I will put it with the others. We need to keep track of who sent cards so we can send thank you notes." I took a step back. I said, "I have got it, Brian. Sit down." Emily stood up from the couch now. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It went from awkward to hostile. They were like wolves who smelled blood. "Dad," Emily said, her voice sharp. "Why are you acting so weird? Did Mom have a secret account? Is that what this is? Did she leave cash?" "There is no cash," I snapped. Brian laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You are lying. I can tell. You always twitch your left eye when you lie." "Give me the envelope, Dad. I am the executor of the estate technically, so I have a right to see all financial documents. You are not the executor." I said, my anger finally rising above my grief. "I am still alive, Brian. Everything is mine." Brian's face turned red. He looked at Emily, then back at me. He took another step, and for the first time in my life I felt physically threatened by my own son. He was taller than me now. He was younger, and he was desperate. I clutched my chest, feeling the brass key through the fabric. I realized then that McAllister was right. I did not know who my wife was. But more terrifyingly, I did not know who my children were. Before I continue the story and tell you what I did next, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own family? Like the people you raised turned into people you do not recognize. If you have hit that like button, it tells me I am not alone in this. I looked Brian in the eye. I summoned every ounce of authority I had left from 40 years of managing construction crews. I pointed a shaking finger at the door. "Get out," I said. Brian blinked, surprised by my tone. "What?" I said, "Get out. Both of you. Go home. I need to grieve my wife alone." Brian clenched his fists. He looked at the pocket of my jacket one last time. He weighed his options. He could attack me and take it, but that would be assault. He decided to wait. He smiled a fake plastic smile that made my skin crawl. "Okay, Dad. Okay. We are going. We just worry about you, that is all. You are clearly stressed. We will come back tomorrow morning to help you sort through mom things. We really need to find those bank statements." They gathered their coats. As they walked out the door, Emily turned back and said, "Dawn not do anything stupid, Dad. Mom would want us to handle the money. She knew you were getting fragile." The door clicked shut. I locked it. Then I engaged the deadbolt. Then I slid the chain across. I leaned my back against the door and slid down until I hit the floor. The house was silent again, but now the silence felt heavy with secrets. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely break the wax seal. I tore it open. A heavy brass key fell onto the floor with a clang. It looked ancient. And then I unfolded the letter. Catherine handwriting. The loops and curves I had known for 40 years. "Jack, if you are reading this, I am gone. And if my calculations are correct, the vultures are already circling." I read the letter under the dim light of the hallway. Every word was a hammer blow to my reality. She talked about a bet. She talked about a life I knew nothing about. And then I read the final line. "They are watching you, Jack. Check the smoke detector in the hallway." I looked up. The smoke detector blinked with a tiny red light, a rhythm that was not normal. I stood up, grabbed a chair, and climbed up. I twisted the cover off. Inside, nestled behind the battery, was a tiny camera and a microphone. I nearly fell off the chair. My own son. My own daughter. They had been bugging my house. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Brian. "Get some rest, Dad. We will see you bright and early. Dawn not lose that envelope." I realized then that I could not stay here. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. If they knew about the envelope, they would not stop until they had it. I looked at the key. I looked at the address in Scotland. I grabbed my passport from the desk drawer. I did not pack clothes. I did not pack toiletries. I grabbed my medication, my wallet, and the key. I slipped out the back door into the rain, leaving my car in the driveway to make them think I was still home. I walked 3 blocks to the gas station and called a cab from a payphone. "Take me to the airport," I told the driver. "Where are you flying to?" he asked. "As far away from my family as I can get," I whispered. But as the taxi sped towards the airport, I had no idea that Brian had one more tracker I did not know about, and my escape was about to turn into a hunt. The hours before I got into that taxi were a masterclass in deception. We sat around the dining table that I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. The smell of expensive Thai takeout filled the room because neither of my children offered to cook a meal on the day we buried their mother. Brian poured himself a glass of my vintage red wine without asking. He swirled it around the glass, watching the crimson liquid coat the sides. Emily picked at her food, her eyes darting around the room as if she was already redecorating it in her mind. The silence was thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Brian cleared his throat and put on his best sympathetic face. The same face he used when he asked me for a loan to start his cryptocurrency venture last year. "Dad, He started his voice low and practiced. We have been talking. Emily and I are really worried about how you are going to manage all of this. He gestured vaguely at the house. This place is massive. The property taxes alone must be a nightmare. And with Mom gone, the upkeep is going to be impossible for one person. Especially at your age. I slowly chewed a piece of chicken, forcing myself to swallow. I am 71, Brian. I am not invalid. I still run 5 miles a week on the treadmill. Emily reached across the table and patted my hand. Her skin felt cold. It is not about your health, Dad. It is about your peace of mind. We want you to grieve without worrying about bills and maintenance. We want to take that burden off your shoulders. We can set up a management trust. Brian and I can handle the finances so you can just relax. Maybe take a trip or move somewhere smaller and safer. I looked at them. My son, the failed businessman. My daughter, the debt-ridden socialite. They did not want to manage my finances. They wanted to drain them. But I knew I had to play the game. If I showed my anger now, they would know I was onto them. I had to be the tired, confused old man they thought I was. I rubbed my temples and let out a long, shaky sigh. I suppose you are right, I said, allowing my voice to tremble just enough. I am feeling very overwhelmed. I cannot think straight today. Everything is a blur. Brian exchanged a quick, triumphant look with Emily. Of course it is, Dad, Emily said soothingly. Why do you not go upstairs and get some rest? We will clean up down here. We can talk about the paperwork in the morning. I nodded slowly, standing up from the table like my joints were made of rusty metal. Thank you, I said. You are good children. I walked up the stairs, listening to their hushed whispers fade behind me, but I did not go to bed. I went into my bedroom, locked the door, and moved a heavy armchair in front of it. Then I opened my closet and pulled out my old laptop. You see, being a structural engineer means you always worry about the integrity of things. Last year, I noticed small amounts of cash missing from my wallet. $50 here, $100 there. I thought I was losing my mind. But just to be sure, I installed tiny pinhole cameras in the main areas of the house. I never told Catherine. I did not want to upset her. I thought maybe it was a housekeeper. I never imagined I would be using them to spy on my own flesh and blood. I booted up the laptop and connected to the secure server. The screen flickered to life, showing me 4 different feeds in grainy high-definition night vision. My heart hammered against my ribs as I maximized the window for the study. Brian was there. He was not cleaning up dinner. He was in my private sanctuary. He had pulled the drawers out of my mahogany desk and was dumping the contents onto the floor. Papers flew everywhere. Insurance policies, old tax returns, blueprints. He was rifling through them with a frantic energy, tearing open envelopes and tossing them aside when they did not contain what he wanted. He looked like a wild animal tearing apart a carcass. I switched the feed to the kitchen. Emily was pacing back and forth, a glass of wine in one hand, her phone in the other. I put on my headphones and turned up the audio gain. The microphone picked up the hum of the refrigerator, and then her voice crystal clear. Yes, I know it is late, she was saying. Look, I need you to fax the admission forms tonight. Yes, for the memory care unit. No, he has not been officially diagnosed with dementia yet, but he is showing all the signs. Wandering, aggression, forgetting who we are. It is for his own safety. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Aggression, forgetting who they are. She was building a narrative. She was creating a paper trail to have me declared incompetent. If they could prove I was mentally unfit, they could take control of everything. The house, the bank accounts, Catherine life insurance. I switched back to the study. Brian was on the phone now, too. He had found my safe in the corner of the room. He was trying random combinations, spinning the dial with sweaty hands. I am telling you, Mark, the money is there, he hissed into the phone. The old man is sitting on a gold mine. This house is free and clear. No mortgage. I checked the deed online. I leaned closer to the screen, my hands gripping the edge of the desk, so hard my knuckles turned white. Listen, Brian said, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. I need you to have the power of attorney papers ready at 8 a.m. sharp. I do not care if it is a rush job. Bring the notary with you. We are going to corner him before he has his morning coffee. He is weak. He will sign anything if we pressure him enough. He laughed a cruel, ugly sound. Once I have that signature, we can list the house by noon. The market is hot. We can flip this place for $1.8 million quick sale. That covers your debt and leaves plenty for me. Just get the papers ready. $1.8 million. That was the price tag they put on my life. That was what I was worth to them. Not a father, not a provider. Just an obstacle standing between them and a payday. I sat back in my chair, the light from the laptop screen illuminating the tears drying on my cheeks. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a confused old man who would roll over and die to make their lives easier. They were wrong. I looked at the time on the screen. It was just past 10 p.m. They were downstairs planning my demise, thinking I was asleep. They had a plan for 8 a.m. That gave me 10 hours. But I did not need 10 hours. I reached into my pocket and touched the brass key Catherine Lawyer had given me. Go alone, the letter had said. Do not trust them. Catherine knew. She had seen this coming years ago. She knew that one day her sweet children would turn into these monsters, and she had given me an escape hatch. I closed the laptop and wiped the drive remotely just in case they found it. I packed my bag with the essentials, my passport, my medication, the deed to the house which I had removed from the safe 2 days ago because I had a bad feeling, and the key. I stood by the window and looked out at the rain. I was leaving the house I built, the home where I raised them, the home where I held my wife's hand as she took her last breath. It broke my heart, but I knew if I stayed, I would lose more than just the house. I would lose my freedom. I waited until the lights downstairs went out. I waited until I heard their footsteps retreat to the guest rooms. Then I moved, silent as a ghost. I crept past their doors, listening to the sound of their breathing. I walked out into the rain, and I did not look back. And that brings us to the taxi ride, to the moment I became a fugitive from my own family. But as I sat in that cab watching the city lights blur past, I realized something. I was not just running away. I was running towards something. Catherine had left me a mystery in Scotland, and for the first time in 40 years, I was going to do exactly what she told me. But I had no idea that Brian was smarter than I gave him credit for. As I handed my passport to the agent at the ticket counter, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from my bank. A withdrawal attempt. Location Glasgow. My blood ran cold. I had not even left the country yet. How did they know? The answer was in my pocket, and it was going to change everything. Tell me in the comments if you would have signed those papers to help your children, or would you have run like I did? Hit subscribe because in the next part I land in Scotland and discover that the old castle is not empty. Someone is waiting for me, and they are holding a shotgun. I stared at the digital clock on my bedside table. The red numbers read 11:42 at night. Every minute that ticked by felt like a countdown to my own execution. At 8 in the morning, my children were coming back with a notary and a lawyer to strip me of my dignity. I knew the legal system. Once they filed that paperwork alleging dementia, it would take me months or even years to fight it. By then, they would have sold the house and drained the accounts. I could not wait until sunrise. I had to move now. I grabbed my old leather duffel bag from the back of the closet. It was dusty and smelled like cedar, but it was sturdy. I did not pack clothes. Clothes are heavy and I could buy new shirts in Scotland. I packed what an engineer calls the critical load: my passport, my birth certificate, the deed to the house which I had retrieved from the safe earlier that week on a hunch, and my medication. I swept the bottles of lisinopril and statins into the bag. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs, I worried I might need a nitroglycerin pill right then and there. Then came the most difficult calculation. My phone, that sleek black rectangle on the nightstand, was a tracking device. Brian had installed the Family Locator app years ago, claiming it was for safety. Now I knew it was a digital leash. If I took it, they would know exactly where I was the moment I left the driveway. But if I left it, they might call, and when I did not answer, they would come over early. I made a choice. I plugged the phone into the charger on the nightstand. Let them track a ghost. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out an old Nokia brick phone I had kept as a backup since 2005. It had a prepaid SIM card I used for emergencies. This was the definition of an emergency. I slipped it into my pocket, along with the heavy brass key. I zipped the bag. It was light. 40 years of life in this house reduced to 5 pounds of paper and plastic. I put on my raincoat and a tweed flat cap. I looked at the room one last time. The bed where Catherine and I slept. The photos on the dresser. I was not just leaving a building. I was leaving my history. But to preserve that history, I had to survive. I opened the bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black. I knew this house better than I knew the back of my hand. I knew that the third step from the top creaked if you stepped in the center, so I hugged the wall. I moved slowly, placing my feet with the precision of a cat burglar. I made it to the landing when a sound froze the blood in my veins. A door handle turning. It was the guest room down the hall. Brian room. I pressed myself into the shallow alcove where the linen closet was. The shadows were deep there, but if he turned on the hallway light, I was finished. The door creaked open, and a slice of yellow light cut across the darkness. Brian stepped out. He was wearing boxer shorts and a t-shirt that was too tight for his stomach. He looked disheveled and grumpy. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it. Thump, thump, thump. I held my breath, my lungs burning. Brian did not look towards the stairs. He turned towards the bathroom, rubbing his eyes. He was muttering to himself. Something about interest rates and fast cash. He walked right past me. I could smell the stale wine on his breath. He was 5 feet away. If I sneezed, if I shifted my weight, if the floor settled, he would see me. And if he saw me with a bag in the middle of the night, the charade would be over. He would physically stop me. I knew that now. He was younger and stronger and desperate. He went into the bathroom and closed the door. The lock clicked. I let out a breath that was more like a silent scream. I had maybe 2 minutes. I moved. I did not run, but I walked with urgent purpose. I skipped the creaky step. I glided down the staircase, gripping the banister to take the weight off my feet. I reached the foyer. The front door was too loud. The heavy oak door had a tendency to stick in the damp weather. I headed for the kitchen. I had oiled the hinges on the back door 3 months ago. Good maintenance pays off. I slid the bolt back. It made a soft metallic slide barely audible over the sound of the rain outside. I turned the handle and stepped out into the cold, wet night. The rain hit my face and it felt like freedom. I gently pulled the door closed until it clicked. I did not lock it. I did not want the sound of the deadbolt to travel through the pipes. I did not go to the garage. Starting a car engine would wake the dead, let alone Brian. I walked. I walked down the long driveway, keeping to the grass, so my shoes would not crunch on the gravel. When I reached the street, I turned left. I had called a taxi company from the landline in the basement 10 minutes ago, telling them to pick me up 2 blocks away at the corner of Elm and Pine. I told the dispatcher I was an early shift worker. The walk was brutal. The wind whipped through my coat. My knees ached. Every pair of headlights that swept down the street made me jump into the bushes like a criminal. I felt a surge of anger. I was a 71-year-old man, a respected professional, a father, and here I was hiding in the shrubbery of my own neighborhood because my children had turned into vultures. I saw the yellow lights of the taxi idling at the corner. I opened the back door and slid in. The heat inside the car fogged up my glasses. SeaTac Airport, I said, keeping my head down. The driver, a young man with a turban, looked at me in the rearview mirror. No luggage, sir. Just the bag. Just the bag, I said. I am in a hurry. We drove in silence. I watched the streets of Seattle pass by, the coffee shops where Catherine and I had Sunday dates, the park where I taught Brian to ride a bike, the mall where Emily threw a tantrum until I bought her that prom dress. Memories flashed by like a sad movie reel. When we got to the airport, I paid in cash. I threw my SIM card from the Nokia into a trash can outside the terminal and bought a new one from a vending machine inside. Paranoia is a survival skill, I told myself. I got through security without issue. No one was looking for me yet. To the world, I was just a retiree going on a vacation. I bought a one-way ticket to Glasgow with a connection in London. I used a credit card I had opened in my own name years ago, one that Brian did not know existed. Boarding the plane felt surreal. When the engines roared to life and the pressure pushed me back into my seat, I finally let my shoulders drop. We lifted off into the dark clouds, breaking through the rain until we were above the storm where the moon was shining on a sea of white. I looked down. Seattle was just a grid of golden lights fading into the distance. Down there, in that dark house, my phone was still plugged in, waiting for a morning alarm that I would never hear. Brian was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of the money he would make from selling my life. I reached into my inner pocket and pulled out Catherine's letter again. I had only read the first part. Now, with the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of the engine drowning out the world, I unfolded the second page. Her handwriting was shaky towards the end. Jack, she wrote, you are probably angry. You are probably wondering why I made that bet. Why I made you wait 40 years. It was not just a joke. It was a test. I knew that if I gave you this secret too early, you would have used it to help the children. You would have bailed Brian out of his first bankruptcy. You would have paid off Emily loans. You are too kind, Jack. And kindness is a weakness when you are dealing with parasites. I paused, wiping a tear from my reading glasses. She knew me so well. The letter continued. The key I gave you opens a door to the past, specifically to 1985. While you were building bridges, I was building a safety net. Go to the Highlands. Find the wine cellar behind the old bookcase in the library. But be warned, Jack. What you find down there is not just wealth. It is a burden. And it will require you to be the man I always knew you could be. Not the nice guy, but the fighter. You won the bet, my love. Now go claim the prize. And for God's sake, do not drink the bottle marked 1985 until you see the whites of their eyes. I folded the letter. A wine cellar, a bottle marked 1985, and a warning to be a fighter. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. The nice guy was left back in Seattle, plugged into a wall charger. The man flying to Scotland was someone else entirely, and he was ready for war. The wheels of the plane touched down in Glasgow with a violent jolt that rattled my teeth. I had not slept for 9 hours. My body felt heavy and brittle like old drywall that had soaked up too much water. I walked through the terminal, clutching my duffel bag to my chest, my eyes scanning the crowd out of habit. I half expected to see Brian or Emily standing there with a sheriff and a court order. But there were only strangers holding signs with names that were not mine. I rented a car. It was a small silver hatchback that smelled faintly of wet dog and stale tobacco. Driving on the left side of the road was a nightmare for a man who had spent 50 years driving on the right, but terror is a good substitute for caffeine. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white, and pointed the car north. The drive was not a scenic vacation. It was a journey into desolation. As I left the city behind, the landscape changed. The rolling green hills turned into jagged black peaks that pierced the low-hanging gray clouds. The rain here was different from Seattle. In Seattle, the rain is a constant, passive presence. Here in the Scottish Highlands, the rain was aggressive. It lashed against the windshield sideways, driven by a wind that howled like a wounded animal. I drove for 4 hours. The roads became narrower until they were just single tracks of asphalt, winding through endless stretches of bog and heather. There were no houses, no gas stations, just sheep standing by the roadside staring at me with indifferent rectangular pupils. The isolation began to seep into my bones. I felt tiny against the scale of this landscape. I was a fugitive old man, driving a cheap rental car into the middle of nowhere, chasing a promise made by a dead woman in 1985. My GPS finally chirped. "You have arrived." I stopped the car. I looked out the window, and my heart sank into my stomach. There was nothing there. Just a rusted wrought iron gate hanging off its hinges, leaning drunkenly against a crumbling stone pillar. A faded wooden sign lay in the mud, barely readable. Altmore Manor. I turned the car onto the gravel driveway, which was more mud than gravel. The tires spun and slipped, fighting for traction. I drove slowly, the branches of overgrown ancient trees scraping against the roof of the car like skeletal fingers. And then the house came into view. I stopped the car and turned off the engine. I sat there for a long time, just staring. If this was the prize, then the game was rigged. The structure in front of me was a ruin. It was a small castle, or a large manor house built from gray stone that looked like it had been quarried from the very mountains around us. But it was dying. Thick green moss covered the walls like a disease. The roof was sagging in the middle, a clear sign of a compromised ridge beam. Several windows were boarded up with plywood that had turned gray with rot. One of the chimneys had partially collapsed, leaving a pile of rubble on the lawn. I am a structural engineer. I look at buildings and I see their bones. I see their health. This building was on life support. I stepped out of the car, and the wind immediately tried to knock me over. I pulled my coat tighter around me and walked towards the front door. My boots squelched in the mud. I looked up at the facade. I saw water damage. I saw rising damp. I saw 50 years of neglect. "Catherine," I whispered into the wind. "What have you done?" Was this her revenge? Was the impossible thing she promised me just a money pit? A final burden to weigh me down before I died? I felt a surge of bitterness. I had left my comfortable home, my paid-off mortgage, my warm bed for this. A pile of wet rocks in a country where the sun apparently never shined. I almost turned back. I almost got back in the car and drove to the nearest airport to fly home and face my children. At least the nursing home Emily wanted to put me in would have central heating and a roof that did not leak. But then I felt the weight of the brass key in my pocket. It felt warm against my hip. Go alone. Do not trust anyone. I walked up the stone steps to the front entrance. The steps were slick with algae. The front door was massive, made of dark oak and bound with iron straps. It looked like the only solid thing in the entire house. I took the key out. My hand was shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. I looked at the keyhole. It was large and intricate. I slid the key in. It fit perfectly. I expected it to be stuck. I expected the mechanism to be rusted shut after 40 years. I prepared myself to use my shoulder to force it open. But the key turned with a smooth, satisfying click. The mechanism was oiled. Recently. I frowned. That was impossible. The gate was broken. The driveway was a mess. The windows were boarded. Who would oil a lock in a ruin? I pushed the door handle down. The heavy oak door swung inward silently on well-greased hinges. I stepped across the threshold, bracing myself for the smell of mildew and rat droppings. I expected darkness. I expected cold, that it was deeper than the outside. Instead, I gasped. The air that hit my face was warm, toasty warm. It smelled of burning pine wood, expensive beeswax polish, and something else. Roasted meat, rosemary, and garlic. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the dim light. I was standing in a grand foyer. The floor was not rotting wood, but polished, checkered marble that gleamed under the light of a massive crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The walls were not covered in moss, but paneled in rich, glowing mahogany. I walked further in my muddy boots, making a squishing sound that echoed in the silence. To my left, through a large archway, was a drawing room. A massive stone fireplace dominated the wall, and a roaring fire was crackling in the hearth, sending dancing shadows across the room. There were Persian rugs on the floor, leather armchairs that looked soft and inviting. The boarded-up windows I had seen from the outside were covered on the inside by heavy velvet curtains blocking the view of the plywood. It was a sanctuary. It was a fortress disguised as a ruin. I stood there, stunned, unable to process the disconnect between the exterior and the interior. Catherine had not bought a ruin. She had bought a hideout, a place that looked worthless to the world, but was a palace on the inside. Just like her. She never wore jewelry. She drove a 10-year-old car, but she had a heart of gold and apparently a secret fortune. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone here?" Silence answered me. Just the crackle of the fire and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I walked towards the fire, drawn to the heat. I held my frozen hands out to the flames. On the small table next to the leather armchair, there was a tray. On the tray was a crystal decanter filled with an amber liquid and a single glass. Beside the glass was a folded note. I picked up the note. It was not Catherine handwriting. It was neat block capitals, sharp and efficient. "Welcome home, Mr. Reynolds. Drink the whiskey. You look like you need it. I am in the kitchen. Do not come in yet. I am finishing the sauce." My heart skipped a beat. I was not alone. Someone had been expecting me. Someone had lit the fire. Someone was cooking dinner. I looked at the hallway that led to the back of the house. A shadow moved across the wall. A large shadow. "Who are you?" I shouted, backing away towards the door. A deep voice echoed from the hallway. A voice that sounded like gravel grinding together. "I am the insurance policy," the voice said. And then heavy footsteps started coming towards me. Thud. 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 I gripped the heavy brass key in my hand like a weapon. I did not know if I was about to meet a friend or an executioner. But one thing was certain. The game Catherine had started 40 years ago was far more complex than I had ever imagined. And the players were already on the board. Tell me in the comments if you would have run out the door or stayed to face the stranger. Because I stayed. And what walked out of the shadows was something I never saw coming. Hit like if you want to see who is hiding in the castle. The massive figure stepped out of the shadows, and the firelight revealed a face carved from granite. He was an older man, maybe my age, but built like a dockworker, with broad shoulders and hands the size of shovels. He wore a pristine black suit that looked strained across his chest. He did not attack me. Instead, he bowed deeply, a gesture of old-world respect that felt out of place in this crumbling castle. I lowered the brass key which I had been holding like a dagger. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice echoing in the large room. He did not answer. He tapped his throat with two thick fingers and then shook his head. He was mute. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small laminated card. I took it. It read, "My name is Angus. I am the caretaker of Altmore Manor. I do not speak and I cannot hear, but I read lips perfectly. Please face me when you talk. Mr. McAllister sent me to serve you." I looked at Angus and nodded. The tension in my shoulders released slightly. "I am Jack," I said clearly. "I suppose you know why I am here." Angus smiled a warm expression that transformed his rugged face. He gestured for me to sit in the leather armchair. He brought the tray of food closer. It was a hearty venison stew, steaming hot. I realized I had not eaten since the funeral reception. I sat down and ate voraciously, while Angus stood by the fireplace adding logs to the fire with a rhythmic precision. When I finished, Angus tapped me on the shoulder. He pointed to the hallway and then made a motion with his hands like opening a book. He wanted me to follow him. We walked through the silent house. The juxtaposition was jarring. The hallways were drafty and smelled of damp earth, but every room we passed was immaculate. We arrived at a set of double doors. Angus pushed them open, revealing a library that would have made a university jealous. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were packed with leather-bound books. A rolling ladder sat in the corner. Angus walked to a specific section of the bookshelf. He pointed to a book on the third shelf. I squinted to read the spine. It was a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. I felt a lump in my throat. That was Catherine's favorite book. She loved the story of patience and long-awaited justice. I pulled the book. It did not slide out. Instead, it clicked. A mechanical latch released with a heavy thud. The entire section of the bookcase swung outward silently, revealing a stone staircase spiraling down into the darkness. Cool air rushed up to meet us, carrying a scent I recognized instantly. Oak, vanilla, and the sharp bite of alcohol. The angel's share. Angus handed me a flashlight and gestured for me to go alone. He stayed at the top of the stairs like a sentinel. I descended into the earth. The steps were cut from solid rock. As I went deeper, the air became controlled. I noticed humidifiers and temperature sensors mounted on the walls. This was not a dungeon. This was a climate-controlled vault. I reached the bottom and flicked a switch on the wall. Banks of industrial fluorescent lights flickered on one by one, illuminating a space that took my breath away. It was a cathedral of wood. Rows and rows of oak casks stretched out into the darkness. They were stacked 3 high, resting on steel racks that looked brand new. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. I ran my hand along the rough wood of the nearest barrel. Stenciled in black ink on the side was a date. 1985. I walked to the next one. 1985. And the next. They were all from 1985. I reached the end of the row, where a small desk sat covered in dust. On it lay a leather ledger and a stack of files. I opened the ledger. It was in Catherine handwriting. October 1985, purchased 500 casks of new make spirit from the closing Altmore distillery. Price per cask $100. Storage fees paid in advance for 50 years. I turned the pages. She had tracked the evaporation rates, the temperature fluctuations, and the flavor profiles for 40 years. She had visited this place every time she told me she was going on a yoga retreat or a girls' trip. While I was fixing bridges in Seattle, she was building a legacy in Scotland. I picked up a document on top of the pile. It was a valuation report from a prestigious whiskey auction house dated just last month. Item: Altmore Reserve, 1985 single malt. Status: extremely rare. The distillery was demolished in 1986, making this the last surviving stock in the world. Estimated auction value per cask, $60,000. $60,000. I dropped the paper. My knees gave out, and I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. I did the math in my head. $60,000 times 500 casks. $30 million. I laughed. It was a dry, hysterical sound that bounced off the stone walls. My wife, the woman who clipped coupons for laundry detergent and argued with the cable company over a $10 fee, had been sitting on a $30 million fortune. She had bet me that if I put up with her for 40 years, she would give me the impossible. She gave me financial freedom. She gave me a kingdom. I looked around the room with new eyes. This was not just alcohol. This was power. This was the leverage I needed to restart my life. I picked up a bottle that was sitting on the desk, labeled Sample Cask 1. I pulled the cork and took a sniff. It smelled like honey and dried fruit and victory. I was about to pour myself a taste when a harsh buzzing sound cut through the silence. It was a red light flashing above the staircase. An alarm. I scrambled back up the stairs, my heart pounding against my ribs. I burst into the library. Angus was standing by the window holding a tablet device. His face was grim. He turned the screen towards me. It was a feed from a security camera at the front gate. A sleek black SUV was tearing up the muddy driveway, forcing its way through the overgrown branches. It skid to a halt in front of the manor, spraying mud onto the stone steps. The doors opened. First came the driver, a large man in a cheap suit who looked like a rented thug. Then from the back seat stepped a man I knew too well. Brian. He looked different than he had at the funeral. He was wearing a tactical jacket and hiking boots. His face was twisted in a snarl of determination. He pointed at the house, shouting something I could not hear. Then the other door opened. Emily stepped out, clutching her designer handbag, looking disgusted by the mud, but equally determined. And finally, a third man emerged. Tall, thin, with silver hair and a briefcase. I recognized him from the news. He was a high-profile American attorney known for aggressive estate litigation. They had found me. I looked at Angus. How, I asked. How did they find me so fast? Angus tapped the screen and pointed to the corner of the image. The timestamp. They had not just found me. They had been tracking me since I landed. Brian walked up the steps and pounded on the heavy oak door. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. "Open up, Dad!" Brian shouted, his voice muffled but audible through the wood. "We know you are in there. We have a court order. Open the door or we are going to kick it down." I looked at the library bookshelf. It was still open, revealing the glow of the gold mine below. If they saw the barrels, they would never let me go. They would declare me insane, lock me up, and drink my fortune dry. I looked at Angus. He was waiting for a command. He looked ready to fight, but he looked to me first. The engineer in me took over. Assess the load. Identify the failure points. Reinforce the structure. Close the shelf, I ordered. Angus pushed the book, and the heavy bookcase swung shut, sealing the secret away. I smoothed my jacket and took a deep breath. I was not the victim anymore. I was the man with the $30 million secret. "Let them in," I said to Angus. Angus looked surprised, but he nodded. He walked out of the library towards the front door. I stood in the center of the drawing room facing the door. I picked up the glass of whiskey I had abandoned earlier. I took a sip. It burned. It was perfect. I heard the heavy bolt slide back. I heard the door creak open. And then I heard the stampede of footsteps entering my sanctuary. Before I tell you what happened when my son walked into that room, I need you to do something for me. If you have ever had a secret that could change your life, hit that subscribe button. And tell me in the comments, what would you do with $30 million? Would you share it, or would you keep it? Brian stormed into the room, his eyes scanning the space until they landed on me. He stopped dead. He saw the fire. He saw the luxury. He saw the glass in my hand. "Found you," he whispered. And then he smiled. But it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who thinks he has just caught a rat in a trap. He was wrong. He was the one in the trap. He just did not know it yet. Brian stormed into the drawing room with the force of a hurricane. The heavy oak door slammed against the wall behind him, sending a vibration through the floorboards that I felt in the soles of my feet. For a split second, I saw the rage in his eyes. It was a raw, primal hunger, the look of a man who has been denied his meal. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the light, and he saw me standing by the fire holding a glass of whiskey, A transformation occurred that was truly terrifying to watch. The snarl vanished from his lips. His shoulders dropped. His face crumpled into a mask of pure anguish. He rushed towards me, his arms outstretched, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the pristine Persian rug. "Dad." He choked out, his voice cracking perfectly. "Oh my God, Dad. You are alive." He threw his arms around me. It was a hug I had wanted for years, a hug I had craved since he was a teenager. But now, as his wet tactical jacket soaked into my dry shirt, I felt nothing but revulsion. It was not a hug of affection. It was a hug of possession. He was checking to see if I was real, if I was solid, if I was captured. I stood stiff as a board, my arms at my sides, holding my whiskey glass out so it would not spill. I did not hug him back. "You can stop the act, Brian," I said, my voice calm and cold. "There is no audience here. Just us." Brian pulled back, gripping my shoulders with hands that were shaking. "It is not an act," he cried, tears actually welling up in his eyes. "Do you have any idea how scared we were? You disappeared. You left your phone. We thought you had a stroke. We thought you were wandering the streets of Seattle in the rain. We flew across the ocean to save you, Dad." "Save me," I repeated, looking him dead in the eye. "Or save the bank accounts." Brian flinched as if I had slapped him. "How can you say that? We are your family." Emily rushed in behind him. She had bypassed the mud and was moving with the efficiency of a triage nurse. She looked frantic. She was carrying a small medical bag which she unzipped on the antique side table, knocking over the coaster. "He is delusional, Brian," she said rapidly, not even looking at me. "I told you, it is the onset of the episode. The flight trauma must have triggered a psychotic break. Look at him. He thinks he is in a castle. He is drinking alcohol." She turned to me, her face pale and sweaty. "Dad, you need to sit down right now. Your heart rate is probably through the roof." "I am fine, Emily," I said, taking a sip of the scotch. "My heart is steady." She ignored me. She pulled a pre-loaded syringe pen from her bag. It looked like an epinephrine injector, but the label was yellow. "This is a sedative," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone one uses with a toddler. "It is mild. It will just calm your nerves and lower your blood pressure so we can get you to a hospital. The doctor in Seattle gave it to me just in case." She uncapped the needle. "Come on, Dad. Just a little pinch in the arm. Do it for Mom." That was the trigger. Do it for Mom, the woman whose memory they were desecrating. Emily lunged forward, reaching for my arm. She moved faster than I expected. But 40 years on construction sites teaches you to react to falling objects. I did not step back. I swung my arm up not to hit her, but to block her. My forearm connected with her wrist. It was a sharp, hard motion. The syringe flew out of her hand. It spun through the air and smashed against the stone hearth of the fireplace. The glass vial inside shattered, and the clear liquid hissed as it hit the hot embers. Emily screamed, clutching her wrist. "He hit me." "Oh my God, Brian, he hit me." "He is violent." "I did not hit you," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "I stopped you from drugging me in my own house. That is enough." The third man, the silver-haired lawyer, stepped forward. He had been watching the scene with the detached boredom of a man who charges $800 an hour. He placed his briefcase on the leather ottoman and snapped the latches open. The sound was loud in the sudden silence. "Mr. Reynolds," the lawyer said, smoothing his silk tie. "My name is Robert Sterling. I represent your children in the matter of your estate and your personal welfare." He pulled a thick stack of documents from the case. They were stamped with the official seal of the King County Superior Court in Washington State. "What is that?" I asked, pointing at the papers with my glass. "This is an emergency ex parte order granting temporary guardianship of your person and your estate to Brian and Emily Reynolds." I laughed. It was a dry, bitter sound. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is Scotland. That is an American court order. Mr. Sterling smiled a thin, predatory smile. That is technically true for the moment. However, we have already contacted the Scottish authorities. Given your flight risk, your history of heart problems, and the violent behavior we just witnessed, which I will be testifying to in an affidavit, the local magistrate will honor this order within the hour. We are here to escort you back to the United States for a full psychiatric evaluation. He stepped closer, holding the paper out like a weapon. You have two choices, Mr. Reynolds. You can come with us voluntarily in a private jet we have chartered, or we can have the local police sedate you and drag you onto that plane in handcuffs. Either way, you are leaving this building tonight. I looked at them. The unholy trinity. My son, the failure, my daughter, the manipulator, and the lawyer, the mercenary. They had me cornered. They had prepared for everything. They had the law on their side. They had the medical narrative, and they had the physical strength. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a tired old man fighting a war I could not win. I looked at the fire, watching the flames dance. I thought about the $30 million beneath my feet. If I left with them now, I would never see it. They would find it eventually. They would sell it. They would drink it. And I would die in a white room with soft walls, wondering where I went wrong. Brian saw my hesitation. He took it for weakness. He stepped away from me, thinking the battle was won. He started pacing the room, his adrenaline still spiking. He ran his hands through his wet hair, exhaling loudly. "Jesus, Dad," he muttered, kicking at the leg of a table. "Why do you have to make everything so hard? We are trying to help you. Do you think I want to be in Scotland in the mud? I have businesses to run." He walked towards the wall of bookshelves, the same wall where the secret door was hidden. I tensed. Angus had closed the bookcase, but old mechanisms are tricky. Sometimes they do not latch all the way. Brian was ranting now, working himself up. "You disappear. You hide in this dump. And for what? Look at this place. It is a ruin. It smells like rot and—" He stopped mid-sentence. He was standing right in front of the Count of Monte Cristo section. He leaned his shoulder against the wood, looking at me with disgust. As he leaned, his weight caused the heavy oak shelf to shift. Just a fraction of an inch. A tiny gap opened up between the bookcase and the wall. It was not enough to see through, but it was enough for the air to escape. The air in the cellar was pressurized, climate-controlled, and saturated with the heavy angelic scent of 40-year-old whiskey. It rushed out through that crack like a spirit released from a bottle. Brian sniffed. He frowned. He sniffed again, deeper this time. The smell hit him. It was unmistakable. It was not the smell of rot or mildew. It was the rich, complex aroma of vanilla, toasted oak, dried figs, and pure alcohol. It was the smell of money. Brian turned around, slowly facing the books. He leaned in, putting his nose to the crack. "What is that?" he whispered. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, confused at first, and then suspicious. He looked back at the shelf. He grabbed the side of the bookcase and pulled. It was locked, but it rattled. "There is something behind here," Brian said, his voice rising in pitch. Emily stopped nursing her wrist. The lawyer looked up from his papers. "What are you talking about?" Emily asked. Brian ignored her. He was like a bloodhound now. He kicked the bottom of the bookcase. A hollow boom echoed from the stone staircase behind it. "There is a room back here," Brian shouted, pointing at the shelf. "Dad, what is back here? Why does it smell like a distillery?" My heart hammered against my ribs. The game changed in an instant. They were not just here for the house anymore. They were seconds away from finding the jackpot. I gripped my glass until my knuckles turned white. I looked at Angus, who was standing in the shadows by the kitchen door. His face was stone, but his muscles were coiled, ready to spring. Brian grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby table. He jammed it into the crack between the bookcase and the wall, trying to pry it open. Jack the lawyer said, stepping forward, his eyes narrowing. "If you are hiding assets behind that wall, it is a federal crime." I took a deep breath. The time for hiding was over. "You want to know what is behind there, Brian?" I asked, my voice steady and loud, cutting through the tension. Brian stopped prying. He turned to look at me, breathing hard. "Yes," he hissed. "What are you hiding, old man?" I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I looked him dead in the eye. "I am hiding your inheritance," I said. "Or at least what is left of it." And then I did the only thing I could do. I smashed my whiskey glass into the fireplace. The explosion of crystal and alcohol sent a flare of fire shooting up the chimney. "Open it," I commanded. But I was not talking to Brian. I was talking to Angus. And as the mute giant stepped forward to trigger the mechanism, I knew that once those doors opened, there would be no going back. The sharks were about to see the blood in the water. The heavy bookcase groaned as the hidden mechanism engaged, swinging inward to reveal the cold stone throat of the staircase. A draft of air rushed up from the depths, carrying the heavy, intoxicating scent of angels share the evaporated alcohol that hangs in the air of every distillery. It smells of vanilla and toasted wood and thyme. Brian did not hesitate. He did not look back at me or ask for permission. He stepped into the darkness, drawn by the scent like a moth to a flame. I watched my son descend. I watched the way his posture changed. He was no longer the angry, confused son looking for his senile father. He was a predator entering a cave. Emily followed him, her high heels clicking precariously on the stone steps. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, adjusted his tie and followed his eyes, scanning the structure, not for beauty, but for liability and asset value. I signaled to Angus. We followed them down. When I reached the bottom step, Brian was standing in the center of the vast underground cathedral. The fluorescent lights were humming overhead, illuminating the endless rows of casks. 500 barrels of American white oak stacked 3 high, stretching back into the shadows. Brian was silent. He was walking slowly down the central aisle, touching the barrels. He ran his hand over the stenciled letters on cask number 42. Altmore, 1985. He stopped. He looked at the date. He looked at the next barrel, 1985. He looked at the vastness of the room. I stood by the stairs, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm. I saw the moment the realization hit him. Brian considers himself a connoisseur. He spends money he does not have on bottle service in clubs. He knows that Japanese whiskey from the 80s sells for thousands a bottle. He knows the market. He did the math in his head. I saw his lips move. 500 casks, roughly 200 bottles per cask. That is 100,000 bottles, even at a conservative estimate. He turned around. His face was pale, but his eyes were burning with a manic, terrifying light. He looked at Emily, who was shivering in the cold air, hugging her designer coat. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Emily shook her head, looking at the dirty barrels with disdain. "It looks like a dusty basement full of old beer, Brian. Let us just get Dad and go." "No," Brian shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You stupid girl! This is not beer. This is liquid gold. This is a ghost distillery. Altmore closed in the 80s. This stuff does not exist anymore. Dad is sitting on the last reserve in the world." He spun around to face me. He threw his arms out wide, laughing a sound that was half joy and half madness. "We are rich. We are filthy rich. Forget the house in Seattle. That is peanuts. This room alone is worth $20, maybe $30 million. He ran towards me. For a second I thought he was going to hug me again, but he stopped 3 feet away. He looked at me and the warmth I had seen earlier was gone. There was no love in his eyes. There was only calculation. He was looking at me the way a butcher looks at a cow. I was no longer his father. I was the owner on the deed. I was the obstacle. You knew, Brian said accusingly. You knew all along. That is why you ran. You wanted to keep this for yourself. You selfish old man. I did not know until tonight. Brian, I said quietly. Your mother left it. Brian laughed. Mom did this. She was smarter than I thought. But it does not matter who did it. It matters who owns it. And right now, that is us. He turned to the lawyer. Sterling, get the papers. Not the guardianship papers, the transfer of assets, the power of attorney. We need to secure this right now before anyone else finds out. We need to transfer the deed of this property and all its contents to the shell company. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, opened his briefcase on top of a barrel. He pulled out a fresh stack of documents. He looked at me with cold, professional indifference. It would be in your best interest to sign, Mr. Reynolds. Managing an asset of this magnitude requires a limited liability corporation and tax strategy that you simply are not equipped to handle. Your children are doing you a favor. Brian snatched the papers from the lawyer. He clicked a pen and marched towards me. Sign it, he commanded. I looked at the paper. It was a broad, durable power of attorney. It gave Brian full control over every asset I owned, real estate, cash, and personal property. If I signed that, I would be a pauper in my own life, dependent on his allowance. I looked at my son. I remembered teaching him to fish. I remembered paying for his first car. I remembered holding him when he cried after his first breakup. Where had that boy gone? I will not sign it, Brian, I said, my voice steady. This is my legacy. Catherine legacy. I am not giving it to you to squander on gambling debts and failed startups. Brian's face twisted. The mask of the concerned son fell away completely, revealing the monster underneath. He stepped into my personal space. He is 3 inches taller than me and 40 pounds heavier. He used his size to intimidate, backing me up until my legs hit the wooden chair behind the desk. You think you have a choice? He hissed, spraying spit in my face. Look around you, Dad. We are in the middle of nowhere, in a soundproof cellar, in a foreign country. No one knows you are here except us. He jabbed the pen towards my chest. You are going to sign this paper. You are going to sign it right now, because if you do not, I am going to leave you here. I will lock that heavy steel door at the top of the stairs. I will board up the house, and I will let you rot in the cold with your precious whiskey. I looked at him, shocked by the depths of his depravity. You would kill me, I asked. You would kill your own father for money. Brian leaned in close, his eyes dead and flat. I am not killing you. I am just letting nature take its course. An old man with a bad heart confusing, wandering off in the highlands. It happens all the time. By the time they find you, the estate will be settled. He grabbed my lapel and shoved me. It was a hard, violent push. I stumbled back and fell heavily into the wooden chair. The impact jarred my spine. My glasses slid down my nose. I looked up at him, gasping for air. Emily, I called out, looking past Brian to my daughter. Emily, listen to him. He is talking about murder. Do something. Emily was standing by the lawyer. She was looking at the barrels, doing her own mental math. She looked at me sitting in the chair, vulnerable and old. She looked at Brian, who was holding the pen like a knife. She did not flinch. She did not rush to help me. She adjusted her silk scarf and looked at me with an expression of utter boredom. Dad, she said, her voice cold as ice. Stop being dramatic. Nobody is going to kill you. Just sign the paper. We need the money. I have a balloon payment due on the house next week. Brian has sharks coming after him. We are desperate, and you are sitting on a pile of cash acting self-righteous. Just sign it and we can all go home. Don, not make this harder than it has to be. Don, not make us hurt you, Brian added, looming over me. He slammed the paper down on the desk in front of me. He slammed the pen down next to it. "Sign," he roared. I looked at the paper. I looked at the pen. I looked at Angus, who was standing in the shadows, his fists clenched, waiting for my signal. Brian did not even know he was there. Brian was so blinded by greed he had forgotten about the giant in the corner. I reached for the pen. My hand was shaking. Not from fear, but from a rage so hot it felt like lava in my veins. They wanted me to sign. They wanted to take everything. I took a deep breath. I looked at Brian one last time. "You really want this?" I asked quietly. "You want the money that bad?" "Yes," Brian said, his teeth clenched. "I want what is mine." I gripped the pen, but I did not move it to the paper. I looked at Angus, and I gave a small, barely perceptible nod. The trap was set. It was time to spring it. But before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you a question. If your children threatened you like this, would you forgive them? Or would you teach them a lesson they would never forget? Let me know in the comments. And hit that like button if you are ready to see a bully get exactly what he deserves. Brian reached out to grab my hand to force me to write, but he never made contact. Because from the shadows, a hand the size of a dinner plate reached out and grabbed Brian by the back of his tactical jacket. And the screaming started. Angus released his grip on Brian at my command, and my son fell to his knees, gasping for air, rubbing his neck where the giant's hand had been. The atmosphere in the cellar was electric with violence. But as I looked at the three of them, my panting son, my terrified daughter, and the calculating lawyer, I realized that physical force was not the answer. If I let Angus throw them out, they would just come back with the police, or worse, they would come back with the people Brian owed money to. No, I needed to end this permanently. I needed to destroy their leverage, and the only way to do that was to let them destroy themselves first. I slumped back into the wooden chair, letting my body go limp. I allowed my hand to tremble visibly, and I clutched my chest, acting out the part of the dying man they so desperately wanted me to be. "Angus, stand down." I whispered, my voice raspy and weak. "I cannot fight them. Look at them. They are young. I am so tired." Brian scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting between me and Angus. He looked like a cornered rat, but as he saw me deflate, his arrogance returned. He straightened his jacket, trying to regain his dignity. "You made the right choice, Dad," Brian said, his voice still shaky but gaining strength. "You almost made a big mistake letting your guard dog attack me. That is assault. We could add that to the list of reasons you need institutionalized." I closed my eyes and let out a wheezing breath. "Water," I croaked. "Please. My throat. I need water before I sign." Emily let out an impatient sigh, but she walked over to the small sink in the corner of the cellar used for rinsing tasting glasses. She filled a dirty glass with tap water and brought it to me. She did not hand it to me gently. She thrust it at my face. "Here," she snapped. "Drink it and sign. We do not have all night." I took the glass with both hands, spilling a little on my shirt to sell the performance. I drank slowly, watching them over the rim of the glass. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was reassembling the papers on the desk, smoothing out the creases. He looked nervous. He was checking his watch. I lowered the glass. "I will sign," I said softly. "I will give you the whiskey. I will give you the house. I will give you the power of attorney." Brian clapped his hands together, a sharp sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Finally. Thank God you came to your senses." But I continued, raising a shaking finger. "I have one condition, one question. I am your father. I changed your diapers. I paid for your colleges. I carried you on my shoulders. If I am going to sign away my life and Catherine's legacy, I deserve to know the truth, not the lies about my health. not the lies about protecting me. Why do you need this money so badly? Why today? Why is it life or death? Brian looked at the lawyer. The lawyer shook his head slightly, warning him to be quiet. But Brian was high on adrenaline and the proximity of $30 million. He felt invincible. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. You want to know? Dad, Brian said, stepping closer, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. You want the truth? Fine. I owe people. Not the bank. Not credit card companies. I owe private investors from Vegas. Bad people. How much, I asked. $5 million, Brian whispered. And I lost it all. Every cent. I thought crypto was going to bounce back, but it crashed. They gave me until Monday. Do you know what happens on Monday if I do not pay them? They do not send a collection agency. They send a cleaner. They are going to kill me, Dad. They are going to cut me into pieces. I felt a chill run through me. My son was not just a failure, he was involved with organized crime. And you, Emily, I asked, looking at my daughter. You do not gamble. Why are you here? Emily crossed her arms defensively. I am not like him, she said, pointing at Brian. My problem is temporary. I borrowed some money from the escrow accounts at the firm. The market was slow, and I needed to maintain appearances. The Porsche, the condo, the country club dues. I thought I could put it back before the audit. She bit her lip, looking away. The audit is on Tuesday. If I do not replace the $600,000 I took, I am going to prison. I will lose my license. I will be humiliated. So that is it, I said quietly. You are not here to save me. You are here to wash your crimes with my whiskey. You want to use this sanctuary to launder your dirty money. It is not laundering, Brian spat. It is survival. We sell the casks to Sterling's private buyer network in Hong Kong. Cash transaction. Untraceable. We pay off the debts, and we still have 20 million left over to live like kings. And you, well, you get to live in a nice facility where you do not have to worry about anything, Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. I think that is enough sharing. The documents, Mr. Reynolds. Sign here, here, and here. He pushed the papers forward. The durable power of attorney. The transfer of deed. The irrevocable trust agreement. I looked at the papers. They were death warrants for my freedom. But they were also the evidence I needed. Brian and Emily had just confessed to extortion, embezzlement, and conspiracy to launder money. And they had done it in front of a witness. But they thought the witness Angus was deaf and mute. They thought I was helpless. They did not know that the pen in my pocket was not just a pen. It was the same high-fidelity recording device I had used to catch my foreman stealing copper wire 10 years ago. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the pen. It was a heavy silver Mont Blanc Catherine had given me for our 25th anniversary. I clicked the top subtly, ensuring the recording light was masked by my thumb. I leaned forward over the desk. My hand hovered over the signature line. Brian was breathing heavily behind me. I could smell his sweat. It smelled of fear and greed. Emily was tapping her foot rhythmically. Do it, Dad, Brian urged. Just sign your name and it is all over. I looked at the paper. I looked at the line that said grantor signature. I thought about the 40 years Catherine and I spent building a life. I thought about the sacrifices, the late nights, the missed vacations. And then I thought about the betrayal, the absolute moral rot standing in front of me. I pressed the pen to the paper. I did not sign Jack Reynolds. I wrote slowly, carefully carving each letter into the paper with enough pressure to tear the fibers. Seeyounhell. I lifted the pen. I looked at the words. See you in hell. I stood up. The act was over. The shaking stopped. The weakness vanished. I stood to my full height of 6 feet, drawing myself up with the posture of a man who has borne heavy loads all his life and is finally throwing them down. "What is taking so long?" Brian asked, reaching for the paper. "Let me see." He grabbed the document. He looked at the signature line. He froze. He squinted, thinking he misread it. He brought the paper closer to his face. "See you in hell," he read aloud, his voice confused. "What is this?" I smiled. A real smile. A cold, dangerous smile. "It is a message, Brian," I said, my voice strong and steady, echoing off the casks. "And it is the only thing you are ever going to get from me." Brian looked up, his face twisting into ugly rage. "You think this is funny, old man. You think this is a game." He crumpled the paper and threw it at me. "Angus," he shouted at the giant in the shadows. "Grab him. Make him sign. Break his fingers if you have to." But Angus did not move to grab me. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made the blood drain from Brian's face. It was not a weapon. It was a badge, a police badge. And then the lights in the cellar flickered and went out, leaving us in total darkness. Tell me in the comments if you saw that coming. Hit like if you are cheering for Jack right now, because the tables are about to turn so fast it will make your head spin. The darkness that fell over the cellar was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating blackness that you only find underground, buried beneath tons of rock and soil. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and the frantic, ragged breathing of my son. The police badge in Angus' hand had been the last thing Brian saw before the lights cut out, and the image must have burned into his retinas like a ghost. Then the chaos started. I heard Brian scream a primal sound of frustration and rage. I heard his heavy boots stomping on the concrete floor, rushing towards where I was sitting. He was blind, but he knew where I was. He was coming to finish what he started. He was coming to wrap his hands around my throat before the law could touch him. I sat perfectly still, gripping the arms of the wooden chair. I did not run. I did not flinch, because I knew something Brian did not. I knew that Angus was not just a caretaker. He was a retired sergeant from the Glasgow police force, and he was standing directly between me and my son. There was a sickening thud of flesh hitting muscle, followed by the sound of air leaving lungs in a violent whoosh. Brian had run full speed into the immovable wall that was Angus. I heard a body hit the floor hard. "Get off me!" Brian shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. "Get off me, you freak!" Then the lights came back on, but they were not the warm yellow fluorescent lights from before. These were blinding white tactical floodlights that had been set up in the corners of the room, unseen in the shadows. They washed out every color, leaving the room stark and clinical like an operating theater. I blinked, shielding my eyes against the glare. When my vision cleared, I saw a scene that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Brian was pinned to the floor, face down. Angus had one knee on Brian's back and one hand holding Brian's wrist in a lock that looked painful enough to snap bone. Brian was thrashing, spitting curses, but he was helpless. Emily was pressed against a stack of whiskey barrels, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She looked like a child who had been caught stealing from the cookie jar. Only the jar was worth $30 million, and the punishment was prison. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, had dropped his briefcase. He was standing with his hands raised in the air, trembling. He knew the game was over. He knew that whatever immunity he thought he had as an American attorney did not apply when he was an accomplice to extortion on foreign soil. And then the heavy steel doors at the top of the stairs banged open. Footsteps marched down the stone spiral, rhythmic and disciplined. Hamish McAllister walked into the cellar. He was not wearing his trench coat anymore. He was wearing a sharp gray suit, and he walked with the authority of a man who owns the room. Behind him were 4 uniformed officers from Police Scotland, their yellow high-visibility jackets stark against the gray stone. McAllister walked past the lawyer without even looking at him. He walked past Emily, who shrank away from him. He walked straight to the desk where I was sitting. He looked at the crumpled paper on the floor, the one that said, "See you in hell." He picked it up, smoothed it out, and placed it gently on the desk. Then he turned to face the room. "Gentleman," McAllister said, his voice calm and resonant, "and Ms. Reynolds, I believe this concludes the negotiation phase of the evening." Brian groaned from the floor, trying to lift his head. "You set us up," he spat, blood dripping from his lip where he had hit the floor. "This is entrapment. You cannot do this. I want my lawyer." McAllister smiled. It was a cold smile, a shark smile. "You have a lawyer, Mr. Reynolds. He is standing right there with his hands in the air. And judging by the sweat on his forehead, I do not think he is going to be much help to you right now." But Brian was not done. He was desperate. He started shouting, lying through his teeth. "They attacked me. My father is senile. He attacked me, and this man assaulted me. I am the victim here. We were just having a family discussion about finances." McAllister reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote control. He pointed it at a speaker system mounted on the wall above the barrels. "A family discussion," McAllister repeated. "Is that what you call it? Let us review the minutes of the meeting, shall we?" He pressed the button. The sound that filled the room was crystal clear. It was the high-fidelity audio from the Mont Blanc pen in my pocket, transmitted in real time to McAllister receiver upstairs. My own voice came out of the speakers, weak and trembling. "Why do you need this money so badly? Why today?" Then Brian's voice. Loud, arrogant, undeniable. "I owe private investors from Vegas. Bad people. $5 million. They are going to kill me, Dad. They are going to cut me into pieces." Brian stopped struggling on the floor. He went completely still. The recording continued. Emily's voice rang out sharp and cold. "If I do not replace the $600,000 I took, I am going to prison." And then the final nail in the coffin. Brian's voice again, filled with malice. "If you do not sign, I am going to leave you here. I will let you rot in the cold." McAllister pressed the button again, and the silence that followed was deafening. The echo of their own confession hung in the air, heavy and damning. There was no way to spin it. There was no context to argue. They had threatened to kill their father and confessed to multiple felonies on tape. McAllister looked down at Brian. Extortion. Conspiracy to defraud. Elder abuse. And uttering threats to kill. "In Scotland, we take these things very seriously, Mr. Reynolds." He nodded to the police officers. Two of the officers stepped forward. They were big men, grim-faced and professional. They hauled Brian up from the floor. He tried to pull away, but they slammed him against the nearest whiskey barrel. "Brian Reynolds," one officer said, his Scottish accent thick and authoritative. "I am arresting you for extortion and assault. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Click. 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 It was the sound of my freedom. It was the sound of the cord finally being cut. Brian looked at me. His eyes were wild. "Dad, tell them. Tell them it was a joke. You cannot let them take me. They will put me in general population. I will not survive. Dad, please." I looked at him. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy I had protected from every consequence his entire life. I had paid his parking tickets. I had paid his rent. I had paid his bail when he got into a bar fight in college. I had shielded him from the world, and in doing so, I had created a monster who thought he could eat me alive. I stood up slowly. My legs felt strong. I walked over to where he was standing, pinned against the barrel. I looked him in the eye. "I am not your victim anymore, Brian," I said quietly, "and I am not your savior. You are a grown man. You made your bet. Now you have to pay it. I turned away from him. Take him away, I said to the officers. Brian started screaming as they dragged him towards the stairs. He screamed curses. He screamed please. He screamed for his mother. But I did not look back. Then the officers turned to Emily. She was shaking her head, backing away until she hit the wall. No, she whimpered. No, I did not threaten him. That was Brian. I just wanted the loan. I am a mother. You cannot arrest me. I have kids waiting for me in Seattle. McAllister stepped in front of her. You admitted to embezzlement on tape, Mrs. Reynolds, and you stood by and watched while your brother threatened to murder your father. You even encouraged him. That makes you an accessory to the extortion and a co-conspirator. He gestured to the remaining officers. Emily screamed as they grabbed her wrists. It was a high, piercing sound that grated on my nerves. Dawn, not touch me. My jacket is Chanel. You are hurting me. Dad, help me. I watched them cuff her. I watched the cold steel lock around her wrists. I thought about the syringe she tried to stick in my arm. I thought about the nursing home brochure she had in her purse. You should have thought about your kids before you tried to drug your father, Emily, I said. They marched her past me. She looked at me with pure hatred. I will never forgive you for this, she hissed. You are dead to me. I looked at her sadly. I have been dead to you for a long time, Emily. I was just a walking checkbook. Now the checkbook is closed. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was the last one left. He was holding his hands out calmly, trying to salvage some dignity. I demand to speak to the American consulate, he said, his voice trembling slightly. McAllister laughed. Oh, do not worry. We will call them. I am sure the American Bar Association will be very interested to hear how you helped your clients plan a hostile takeover of a vulnerable senior citizen estate. I imagine you will be disbarred before your plane lands. The police led him away. I stood alone in the center of the cellar with McAllister and Angus. The noise of the struggle faded as they dragged my children up the stairs. The silence returned to the room. But it was not heavy anymore. It was light. It was clean. McAllister walked over to the barrel where the bottle of 1985 whiskey was still sitting. He picked up the glass I had smashed earlier and sighed. Then he found a clean glass on the shelf. He poured a generous measure of the amber liquid. He handed it to me. Your wife told me you were a patient man, Jack McAllister said. She said you would wait until the very last second to strike. She was right. I took the glass. My hand was steady now. She also told me to give you this, McAllister said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple silver key, much smaller than the brass one. What is this? I asked. McAllister smiled, pointing to a small metal safe box welded to the back of the steel rack behind cask number 1. The final piece of the puzzle, he said. She said you would need it after the storm passed. I walked over to the box. I inserted the silver key. I turned it. Inside was a single VHS tape labeled simply for Jack. I looked at McAllister. We have a video player in the library, he said. I nodded. I downed the whiskey in one gulp, feeling the fire burn away the cold feeling of seeing my children in handcuffs. Let us go, I said. I want to hear what she has to say. I followed him up the stairs, leaving the $30 million in the dark. I did not care about the money right then. I just wanted to see my wife one last time. McAllister held up a hand to the police officers, signaling them to pause. The heavy oak doors at the top of the stairs were open, ready to swallow my children into the justice system. But there was one final piece of business to attend to. One final truth that needed to be spoken aloud, not for the court record, but for the soul of this family. Wait, McAllister said, his voice commanding the room. Before you take them away, there is a document they need to hear. It is the addendum to Catherine Reynolds' last will and testament. Brian stopped struggling against the handcuffs. He looked back at us, his face a mask of sweat and blood, but his eyes still held a flicker of hope. Maybe he thought there was a loophole. Maybe he thought his mother had left him a safety net, despite everything. Emily stopped crying, sniffing loudly, and looking at the lawyer with wide, desperate eyes. McAllister opened a leather folder he had been carrying. He put on his reading glasses. The silence in the cellar was heavy, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system keeping the $30 million fortune cool. Clause 42. McAllister read his tone formal and grave. Also known as the bet. He looked up at Brian and Emily over the rim of his glasses. "Your mother wrote this 20 years ago," he said. "She updated it every year on her birthday. She knew you better than you knew yourselves." He looked back at the paper and began to read. "If at the time of my death my husband Jack Reynolds has survived 40 years of marriage with me, he wins the wager. However, the distribution of the Altmore assets depends entirely on the conduct of our children." Brian leaned forward, straining against the officer grip. "What does it say?" Brian demanded. McAllister continued reading, ignoring the interruption. Scenario A. If Brian and Emily treat their father with love, respect, and dignity during his time of grief, the assets shall be divided equally into 3 shares. 1 for Jack, 1 for Brian, 1 for Emily. I heard Emily let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She slumped against the wall, her knees giving way. $10 million. She had thrown away $10 million because she could not wait a week. She could not pretend to be a decent human being for just a few days. McAllister raised his voice slightly, ensuring every word landed like a hammer blow. Scenario B. If Brian and Emily attempt to coerce, manipulate, threaten, or harm their father in any way to gain access to these assets, their inheritance is immediately and irrevocably revoked. Brian's face went white. "No," he whispered. "That is not legal. You cannot just cut us out." "I am not finished," McAllister said sharply. Scenario C. If Jack Reynolds is harmed physically, or if he is declared mentally incompetent under false pretenses initiated by his children, the entire stock of Altmore 1985 whiskey is to be uncorked and poured into the River Spey. Not a single drop shall be sold. The room went dead silent. Even the police officers looked shocked. It was the ultimate scorched earth policy. Catherine had been willing to destroy a fortune rather than let it fund her children's greed. Brian stared at the lawyer, his mouth hanging open. "She was crazy," he stammered. "She would not do that. She loved us." McAllister closed the folder with a snap. "She loved the children she raised," he said. "Not the predators you became. She protected Jack from you. And tonight you proved her right." Brian's face twisted. The shock turned back into rage. He lunged forward again, fighting the cuffs, the veins in his neck bulging. "You cannot do this to me," he screamed, his voice echoing off the stone vault. "Dad, look at me. I am your son. I am your only son. You cannot let them take me to prison. You cannot keep all this money. It is blood money." He was crying now, ugly, desperate tears mixed with snot and blood. "Dad, please. I made a mistake. I was desperate. Do not let them ruin my life. I am your boy. Remember fishing at the lake? Remember my graduation. I am your boy." I stood there feeling a pain in my chest that was sharper than any heart attack. I looked at the man screaming in front of me. I tried to see the little boy with the scraped knee. I tried to see the teenager who wanted to be an astronaut. But all I could see was the man who had threatened to leave me to rot in the cold. All I could see was the stranger who had looked at me as a paycheck. I walked slowly towards him until I was just out of reach. I looked him deep in the eyes, searching for any trace of the son I once knew. But there was nothing there. Just greed. Just fear. Just a hollow shell. "I do not have a son," I said, my voice low and trembling with the weight of the truth. Brian stopped screaming. He stared at me. "I had a son once," I continued, tears finally spilling over my cheeks. He was kind. He was funny. But he died a long time ago. I do not know who you are, but I know what you are. You are a man who tried to sell his own father into a mental institution. You are a man who threatened to kill me for a barrel of alcohol. I stepped back, turning my back on him. Get them out of here, I whispered. Brian started screaming again, a high-pitched wail of despair as the officers dragged him towards the stairs. You will rot in hell, old man. I hate you. I hope you die alone. Emily did not scream. She just wept softly, her head hanging low as she was led away. She did not look at me. The shame was finally real. I stood there listening to their footsteps fade up the spiral staircase. I listened to the heavy steel doors slam shut. I listened to the sound of the locking mechanism engaging, sealing the world out. And then silence. Absolute, crushing silence. I looked at McAllister. He was busy packing his papers, giving me a moment of privacy. Angus had melted back into the shadows. I was alone with $30 million. I was the winner of the bet. I was rich beyond my wildest dreams. And I had never felt more destitute in my life. My legs finally gave out. I sank onto the floor, right there on the cold concrete. I leaned my back against a cask of 1985 whiskey, and I buried my face in my hands. I did not cry because I was scared. I did not cry because I was relieved. I cried because I had failed. A father's job is to raise good men, to raise strong women, to put good people into the world. I had built skyscrapers that withstood earthquakes. I had built bridges that carried thousands of people. But the most important structure of my life, my family, had collapsed. I sobbed, my body shaking with the force of it. I cried for Brian. I cried for Emily. I cried for the little kids they used to be and the monsters they had become. And mostly, I cried for Catherine because she had seen this coming 40 years ago, and I had been too blind to see it until it was too late. I sat there for a long time, letting the grief wash over me. The money did not matter. The castle did not matter. At that moment, I would have traded every drop of that whiskey just to have a family that actually loved me. But we do not get to trade with fate. We only get to play the hand we are dealt. After a while, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was McAllister. He did not say anything. He just handed me a handkerchief. I wiped my eyes and looked up at him. It is done, he said softly. Yes, I said, my voice hoarse. It is done. But it is not over, McAllister said. You have a tape to watch, and I think she has one more surprise for you. I nodded slowly, pushing myself up from the floor. My bones ached, my heart ached, but I was still standing. I am ready, I said. Tell me in the comments if you think I was too hard on them, or if I did what had to be done. Hit subscribe to see the final message my wife left me. It changes everything. The silence that followed the departure of the police was heavy, but it was the clean heaviness of a storm that has finally passed. The air in the cellar no longer smelled of fear and sweat. It smelled only of the damp stone and the sweet, slumbering spirit of the whiskey. McAllister did not rush me. He poured himself a small measure of the 1985 vintage and stood by the stairs, allowing me the dignity of composing myself. I wiped my face with the handkerchief he had given me. The tears were gone now, replaced by a cold numbness that I knew would eventually turn into a scar. I walked over to the desk where the crumpled paper with my message still lay. See you in hell. I picked it up and smoothed it out. It was not just a message to my son. It was a message to my old self. The Jack Reynolds who was a doormat was dead. The man standing in the cellar was someone new. McAllister placed a fresh stack of documents on the desk. These were different from the ones Brian had tried to force me to sign. These were legal affidavits regarding the criminal proceedings. We have some decisions to make, Jack McAllister said, his voice gentle but businesslike. The police are processing them now. Brian will be facing extradition to the United States almost immediately. The federal authorities there have flagged his passport due to the outstanding debts and his connection to known organized crime figures in Las Vegas. I looked at McAllister. What happens when he goes back? I asked. McAllister took a sip of his drink. He goes into federal custody first. But given the nature of his creditors, I suspect his time in prison will be the safest place for him. If he makes bail or if he is released, the people he owes $5 million to will be waiting. They are not known for their patience. I thought about that. I thought about my son facing the sharks he had swam with voluntarily. A part of me, the father part, wanted to ask McAllister if we could pay the debt. $5 million was a drop in the bucket compared to the $30 million sitting in this room. I could save his life with a signature. I could clear his slate. But then I remembered the look in Brian's eyes when he told me he would leave me to rot. I remembered that he was willing to kill me to save himself. If I bailed him out now, I would not be saving him. I would just be teaching him that there are no consequences for evil. Let him go back, I said, my voice steady. Do not pay his bail. Do not pay his legal fees. If he needs a lawyer, he can use a public defender. He wanted to be a big shot in the underworld. Now he can live in it. McAllister nodded, making a note on his pad. And Emily? I sighed. Emily was less violent, but perhaps more insidious. She had used her position of trust to steal from innocent people. Contact the Real Estate Licensing Board in Washington State, I said. Send them the recording of her confession, and send a copy to the partners at her firm. She needs to be disbarred. She cannot be allowed to handle other people's money ever again. It sounds harsh, I know. But a structural engineer knows that if you find a rotten beam, you do not paint over it. You cut it out before it brings the whole house down. Emily had to hit rock bottom before she could ever hope to climb back up. I was not destroying her life. I was stopping her from destroying anyone else. Now, McAllister said, closing the folder on my children. We need to discuss the practicalities. You are currently the owner of a very expensive, very vulnerable asset. We need security, we need staff, and we need cash flow immediately to pay for it all. I looked around the room. I had $30 million in potential wealth, but I had less than $2,000 in my checking account. I was asset rich and cash poor. Sell the first 10 casks, I said. McAllister raised an eyebrow. Already? I nodded. I want them gone by morning. Contact that buyer in Hong Kong, the one Brian mentioned. Or use your own network. I do not care who buys them as long as the check clears. I need liquid cash to fortify this castle. I want a full security team. I want cameras on every corner. I want a new gate. And I want this cellar sealed so tight that even a ghost could not get in without a code. McAllister smiled. You are thinking like a businessman, Jack. Catherine would be proud. He made a phone call right there in the cellar. He spoke in rapid-fire legal jargon mixed with numbers. Within 20 minutes, he hung up. It is done, he said. A private collector in London has agreed to purchase 10 casks of the Altmore 1985 for $60,000 each. He is wiring the funds to an escrow account I have set up for you. $600,000 will be available to you within the hour. $600,000. In my old life, that was 10 years of salary. Here it was just 10 barrels. The reality of my new life began to sink in. I was free. I could go anywhere. I could do anything. But all I wanted to do was finish the job. I walked down the long aisle of barrels, counting them as I went. We marked the 10 that would be sold with chalk. As I reached the end of the row, I found myself standing in front of cask number 1. It was different from the others. The wood looked darker, older, and while the other barrels had the faint, sweet smell of evaporation, this one seemed sealed tighter. I ran my hand over the lid. There was something taped to the top of it, a small, rusted key. I picked it up. It was not a key for a door. It looked like a key for a padlock. I looked at the bung, the wooden stopper that seals the barrel. It had a small metal hasp over it, secured by a tiny padlock. None of the other barrels had this. McAllister walked up behind me. "That one is not for sale," he said softly. "I know," I said. I inserted the key into the padlock. It turned with a stiff click. I pulled the hasp off. Then I worked the wooden bung loose. I expected the smell of whiskey to hit me, but it did not. I shined my flashlight into the hole. The barrel was empty of liquid. Instead, resting on the bottom of the dry cask, was a plastic waterproof bag. I reached in my arm, scraping against the rough wood. I grabbed the bag and pulled it out. It was covered in dust, but sealed tight. I opened it. Inside was not money. It was not documents. It was a VHS tape. I held it up to the light. The label was handwritten in Catherine distinctive script. The ink was faded but legible. For Jack. "Watch me when you win." I felt a lump form in my throat. A VHS tape. It made perfect sense. In 1985, this was the cutting edge of technology. She had recorded this 40 years ago. She had placed it in this barrel, sealed it up, and waited. She had waited a lifetime for me to find it. I looked at the tape in my hands. It felt heavy, not with weight, but with significance. This was her final voice, her final instruction. McAllister cleared his throat. "There is a VCR in the library upstairs," he said. "I kept it in working order. She told me to make sure of that." I clutched the tape to my chest. I felt a sudden wave of nervousness. I had faced my children. I had faced the police. I had faced the loss of my family. But facing Catherine's voice from beyond the grave felt like the hardest thing yet. What if she was disappointed in me? What if she had known I would hesitate? But then I remembered the note. "Watch me when you win." I had won. I had survived the trap. I had protected the legacy. I turned to McAllister. "Let us go upstairs," I said. "I want to hear what she has to say." We walked out of the cellar, leaving the millions of dollars behind in the dark. As we climbed the spiral staircase, I held the tape tight. I did not know what was on it, but I knew one thing. It was going to be the truth. And after a lifetime of lies, the truth was the only thing I was hungry for. Tell me in the comments if you still own a VCR or if you remember watching movies on tape. Hit like and subscribe because the final message from Catherine is going to reveal a secret that changes the meaning of the entire bet. You do not want to miss the end of this story. The VCR hummed with a mechanical whir that sounded like a time machine powering up. It was a sound I had not heard in decades. I sat in the leather armchair in the library, my hands gripping the armrests so tightly that the leather creaked. McAllister stood by the window giving me space, but I could feel his presence like a silent guardian. The television screen crackled with static, a blizzard of black and white noise that danced for a few seconds before stabilizing into a picture that stole the air right out of my lungs. There she was. Catherine. But it was not the Catherine I had buried last week. This was Catherine from 1985. She was wearing her wedding dress, the veil pushed back over her dark curls. Her face was unlined, her eyes bright with mischief and vitality. She was holding a glass of cheap champagne and sitting on the edge of a hotel bed. The timestamp in the corner of the screen blinked. June 15th, 1985. Our wedding night. "Hello, Jack," the young Catherine said. She leaned into the camera, whispering as if sharing a conspiracy. "If you are watching this, it means two things. First, it means we made it. You put up with my craziness for 40 years. And second, it means I am dead. Because let us be honest, I was never going to let you see this while I was alive. You would have tried to talk me out of it." I smiled through my tears. She was right. I would have. The camera on the screen shook slightly as she adjusted it. "Listen to me, Jack," she continued, her voice turning serious. "Today we made vows, for richer, for poorer. But I have a feeling we are going to be okay on the richer part. I just made an investment, a crazy one. I bought a ghost distillery in Scotland. Everyone says I am mad. They say whiskey is dead. But I have a gut feeling, Jack. This is our safety net. Not for us, but for you." The screen flickered violently. The image tore and distorted the tracking lines rolling up the screen. When the picture stabilized again, the hotel room was gone. The wedding dress was gone. It was replaced by the familiar background of our living room in Seattle. The date stamp read November 2023, just 2 months before she passed. The contrast was physically painful. Catherine sat in her favorite chair, a blanket draped over her thin legs. Her hair was white and thin, her face gaunt from the illness she had fought so bravely. But her eyes, those eyes were exactly the same. Fierce, intelligent, uncompromising. Jack the older. Catherine said, her voice raspier but commanding, "If you are watching this, then the worst has happened. The vultures have circled, and I know exactly who they are. Brian and Emily." She paused, taking a breath that rattled in her chest. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, my love, because I am going to say things that will hurt. But I am saying them to save you. I know you, Jack. You are the kindest man I have ever met. You are gentle. You are forgiving. You are a builder who wants to fix everything and everyone." She leaned forward towards the camera lens. "But you have a fatal flaw, Jack. You are an enabler. You cannot say no to the people you love. You let Brian get away with murder his whole life. You bailed him out every time he fell. You let Emily treat you like a bank account because you thought buying her things would make her happy." I flinched. It was the truth. A hard, jagged truth that I had spent a lifetime avoiding. "I knew this day would come," she continued. "I knew that when I was gone, there would be no one left to play the bad cop. No one left to protect you from their greed. You see, Jack, our children are like me. They have my ambition. They have my drive for more. But they inherited the worst parts of me. They are ambitious, but they are lazy. They want the prize without the work. And without me there to check them, they will try to eat you alive." On the screen, she wiped a tear from her cheek. "That is why I made the bet. That is why I hid the money. I did not hide it from you. I hid it for you. I knew that if I gave you access to $30 million while I was alive, you would have given it to them. You would have paid Brian debts. You would have bought Emily another house. And they would have learned nothing. They would have drained us dry and left us with nothing but heartbreak." She looked straight into the lens, piercing through time and space. "So I had to be the villain. I had to be the eccentric wife with her secrets. I had to set this trap. Because I knew that the only way for you to survive without me was for you to see them for who they really are. You needed to be pushed into a corner, Jack. You needed to get angry. You needed to find your backbone." I watched her face the face of the woman who had played a 40-year-long game of chess against her own children to save her husband. "You have won the bet, Jack," she said softly. "But the prize is not the whiskey. The prize is not the money. The prize is your freedom. You are free from the obligation to save people who do not want to be saved. You are free to live the life we talked about. Travel. Build something new. Be the man I fell in love with. The strong man. Not the doormat." The video began to fade. The older Catherine smiled a weak but triumphant smile. "I love you, Jack Reynolds. I loved you enough to lie to you. I loved you enough to make you wait. Now go out there and live. Do not look back. And for heaven's sake, drink the good stuff." The screen went black. Then the static returned, filling the room with its white noise hiss. I sat there for a long time, staring at the gray fuzz. The silence in the room was absolute, but inside my head, the storm had finally cleared. I understood it all now. Every argument we had about money. Every time she refused to help Brian. Every time she scolded me for spoiling Emily. It was not stinginess. It was strategy. She had been building a fortress around me brick by brick for 4 decades, waiting for the day I would need it most. She had sacrificed her image in my eyes. She had let me think she was difficult. She had let me think she was secretive, all to ensure that when I was finally alone, I would be standing on solid ground. I reached out and pressed the eject button. The tape popped out with a mechanical clunk. I held it for a moment, feeling the warmth of the plastic. "Thank you, Catherine," I whispered. I stood up. My knees did not creak. My back was straight. The heaviness that had pressed down on my shoulders since the funeral, since the moment Brian asked to sell the house, was gone. I walked over to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains. Outside, the storm had passed. The Scottish Highlands were bathed in a pale, cold sunlight that illuminated the rugged beauty of the landscape. It was harsh, yes, but it was solid. It was enduring. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I did not see a 71-year-old widower who had lost his family. I saw a man who had survived a siege. I saw a man who was worth $30 million. But more than that, I saw a man who was finally free. McAllister was watching me. He had poured 2 fresh glasses of the 1985 Altmore. He held one out to me. "To Catherine," he said. I took the glass. I looked at the golden liquid, the legacy she had left me. "To Catherine," I said, my voice strong and clear. "And to the future." I drank. It tasted like fire and honey. It tasted like life. I turned away from the window. "McAllister," I said, setting the glass down. "Call the contractors. Call the security firm. And call a real estate agent. I want to buy the land surrounding this manor. All of it. If we are going to build a new life, we are going to build it big." I was Jack Reynolds, and I was just getting started. If you enjoyed this story of justice and long-awaited freedom, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, what is the greatest sacrifice someone has ever made for you? I will see you in the next story. Stay strong. It has been 6 months since I first walked through the rotting doors of Altmore Manor. Back then, I was a fugitive shivering in a coat that was too thin for the Scottish winter, running from the only family I had left. Today, the doors are open wide, but they are no longer rotting. We replaced the oak beams. We restored the stone facade. And most importantly, we brought life back to this place. The air that was once heavy with mildew is now filled with the sound of laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the rich aroma of the world's finest whiskey. I am standing on the terrace overlooking the highlands. The heather is blooming, painting the hills in vibrant shades of purple and gold. Behind me, inside the great hall, a group of whiskey connoisseurs from Japan are bidding on cask number 42. McAllister is managing the auction. He has become more than a lawyer to me. He is my business partner. Angus is there too, wearing a suit that actually fits him, heading up the security team. He still does not speak, but he does not have to. His presence alone demands respect. We turned the manor into an exclusive tasting venue. It is by invitation only. People fly in from all over the world, not just to drink the liquid gold Catherine left behind, but to hear the story. The story of the woman who bet on her husband. My phone buzzes in my pocket. I pull it out. The screen lights up with a number I have memorized, but will never answer. The caller ID reads Federal Correctional Institution. It is Brian. It is Tuesday, which means it is his allocated time for phone calls. He calls every week. McAllister tells me that Brian is trying to get me to pay for an appeal. He claims he has changed. He claims he has found religion. He claims he is sorry. I look at the phone. My thumb hovers over the decline button. 6 months ago, my hand would have shaken. I would have felt guilty. I would have wondered if I was being a bad father. But today, my hand is steady as a rock. I am not punishing him. I am simply refusing to participate in his destruction any longer. I am refusing to be the safety net that catches him when he jumps off a cliff. I press the side button, silencing the call. I slide the phone back into my pocket. I do not feel anger. I do not feel sadness. I feel peace. It is a strange sensation for a man who spent 40 years walking on eggshells. I turn back to the table on the terrace. Sitting there is a single glass of the Altmore 1985. It catches the sunlight, glowing like a captured star. I pick it up. The liquid coats the glass thick and oily, just the way a 40-year-old spirit should. I think about Emily. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a dental clinic in Ohio, living in a small apartment. She lost her real estate license. She lost her Porsche. She lost her status. But McAllister tells me she is actually paying her own bills for the first time in her life. Maybe in 10 years she will understand. Maybe she never will. That is not my burden to carry anymore. I swirl the whiskey in the glass. I look out at the horizon where the rugged mountains meet the sky. I used to think that building skyscrapers was my legacy. I wanted to build things that touched the clouds. But I realize now that the most important thing you can build is your own self-respect. Catherine gave me the bricks, but I had to mix the mortar myself. I take a sip. The flavor explodes on my tongue. Honey, smoke, dried apricots, and a finish that lasts forever. It is the taste of patience. It is the taste of a victory that was hard won. I realize now that family is a word we use too loosely. We think it means biology. We think it means DNA shared across generations. But I have learned the truth. Family is not the blood that runs through your veins. Family are the people who stand by you when the walls are crumbling. Family are the people who hand you a flashlight when you are in the dark. Angus is my family. McAllister is my family. And Catherine, even though she is gone, is the head of this household. Sometimes you have to prune the tree to save it. You have to cut off the dead branches so the trunk can survive. It is a painful gardening, but it is necessary. I had to protect myself from my own blood to survive. And standing here breathing this clean air, I know I made the right choice. I raise my glass to the empty chair across from me. It is Catherine's chair. It always will be. You were right, my love, I whisper to the wind. The view from here is spectacular. I finish the drink and set the glass down. The auction inside is ending. I hear applause. Another cask sold. Another $1 million for the foundation. I started to help victims of financial abuse. I straighten my jacket. I have guests to greet. I have a business to run. And I have a life to live. A life that finally belongs to me. My name is Jack Reynolds. I am 71 years old. And for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The lesson. This story is a harsh reminder that unconditional love does not mean unconditional tolerance. Many of us are taught that we must support our family no matter what, even when they abuse us, exploit us, or threaten our safety. But Jack's story teaches us that setting boundaries is an act of self-respect. Enabling a toxic person is not love. It is a form of participation in their bad behavior. True wealth is not the money in the bank. It is the freedom to wake up in the morning without fear. Never set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you know a Jack who is still trapped. Help them find their key. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice, resilience, and the human spirit. Leave a comment below and tell me what is the hardest boundary you have ever had to set with a family member. I read every single one. Until next